I'm tuning in today from Ohio. Turtle Island was the name of what is now known as United States, that was given to the land by indigenous nations that have been displaced and murdered since. I want to acknowledge that. In the interest of time, I'm not reading the entire statement. I posted it in the chat, so you know there is a history. It's actually really relevant that we are bringing in indigenous nations, because the concept of heteronormativity was actually imported by uninvited white settlers, right? Many nations were post-heteronormative before before white settlers came. And we want to tackle today, talk a little bit about FLINTA and TERF. What is it? How is TERFness harmful? And connect. We talked a lot about language, which is so important. And as feminists, you know, Sprache schafft Wirklichkeit. I would like to connect what that does and how it really impacts life chances of trans and non-binary intersex people in the world. And when Ellie invited me to do this talk, I shared that with an old colleague from Graz, founding mother of one of the largest autonomous feminists NGOs in Graz, cool woman. And here's what she emailed. Then I realized, wow, so we are really getting into a wasp's nest here. She's sharing. Basically, I did not spend my whole life fighting for women's rights to now de-gender and talk about people only and use gender-neutral pronouns. She perceives that as a loss and as a threat to her feminist, so important activism. So then we come to understand that basically the acronym FLINTA, that stands for women, lesbians, intersex, non-binary, trans, and agender people, is actually a little complicated because it's not as homogeneous. It's not as unproblematic as this seems if we talk about FLINTA inclusion and the star with everything, all kinds of identities. So the I and T in this FLINTA is problematic and is not as embraced by all corners of the feminist movement. So one of the blessings and curses, maybe, of the feminist movement is that there is no feminism, right? There is a lot of different feminisms, and they don't always see eye to eye, and that has produced very generative theory and practices. When I look at these trans exclusionary radical feminisms today that have to become known as TERF, and that starts very early in the second wave feminist movement, 1979. Janice Raymond's book, The Transsexual Empire, is often quoted as sort of the foundational book in this radical exclusion of transgender people, which is very interesting because often these are lesbian authors. And it's interesting because in 1969, Patty Friedan called for the exclusion of lesbians in the feminist movement, and talked about the lavender menace, that lesbians were not embraced. So now lesbians make their way into the mainstream feminist movement, the political movement. But here we have a new scapegoat, transgender women in particular, that are seen as male perpetrators in women's dresses, quote unquote, and trans men as traitors to the lesbian movement. And the writings, basically, these trans exclusionary writings, hit the political fan in the beginning of the 90s, when the political transgender movement takes off in the United States, at least. And when 1991, a transgender woman gets expelled from the Michigan Women's Music Festival because she's identified as trans. And with 1992, transgender activists are showing up at the Michigan Women's Festival and are protesting in what has come to be known as Camp Trans, if over the next decade, really, they protested. Other writings occurred. Sheila Jeffreys is a UK-born Australian activist who is very prominent in the TERF movement. And of course, you probably have heard Alice Schwarzer's views, and this has spilled in recent years, particularly since 2020, since the pandemic, into social media spaces, when J.K. Rowling came out, the Harry Potter author, as transphobic, and then even Alice Walker, Black author, speaks up, and people use the hashtag I stand with J.K. Rowling, and actors of Harry Potter withdraw and distance themselves. And you may have heard of other feminist authors like Chimamanda Ngozi, the African author, also very transcritical. So that is being handled as the TERF wars, basically, and ideological wars. Let's look a little bit at the theoretical underpinnings. Where does that come from? The discomfort with transgender existence and sometimes the hate. So different roots here, different feminisms. For once, radical feminism that sees patriarchy, the male dominance, as primary axis of inequality. So through this lens, transgender identities reinforce gender stereotypes. So non-binary identities are basically not existent in this view, and they see radical feminists such as Sheila Jeffreys, Janice Raymond, see transgender identities as a threat, not only to women, but to women's bodies. And literally, Sheila Jeffreys said she sees trans women as men who parasitically occupy the body of the oppressed. And a little different theoretically is difference feminism that insists on sexual difference as an ontological difference. And that is very tied to the mystique of motherhood and very tied to reproductive functions, where trans people contradict the normative bind between bodies and identities. And then trans women are not really women because they cannot give birth, and trans men are not really men because they are way too similar to female bodies in order to be a man through this theoretical lens. And they all mesh together, they all blend together. And that's where I think my former colleague is coming from, mostly institutional and state feminism that necessarily had to conflate sex and gender for political activism. If we talk about gender equality, we still mean often, not the word L does, but we still mean often women's equality and the multiplicity of genders. If we are now talking only about people, that takes away from the political power the label woman has. In TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists have come to hate the term TERF. They see it as a slur. That's also a hashtag on Twitter. TERF is a slur. And they embrace for themselves mostly the label of gender critical movements. And I was mind blown in the research for this lecture that they really are operating on a global scale and since quite some time. Sheila Jeffreys, for example, is a founding member of Women's Declaration International, that used to be a women's human rights NGO, now called Women's Declaration International. They were very active 1995 in Beijing at the Women's Conference and heavily influenced the Beijing platform on a global level. And the Beijing platform has basically a null definition of gender. Gender is in the declaration, but it's really not defined. And people like Sheila Jeffreys have a big part in that. Janice Raymond was very active in an anti-human trafficking NGO, also paid by the United Nations for decades, basically. activism on this global level, and that basically spills into an anti-pornography and also anti-sex work angle of trans-exclusionary radical feminists. And on a more, the latest of this Women's Declaration International is a declaration on women's sex-based rights, this insistence of the binary, the insistence of heteronormativity, strangely, but in a, not heteronormativity, basically the binary gender, the binary sex system, but an embrace of homosexuality within the binary system. And they claim that they have almost 40,000 individual signatures from 160 countries in collaboration with 527 organizations. So it's pretty far spread. WOLF is the Women's Liberation Front is a US-based NGO that also is busy submitting communications to the United Nations. And you have these strange coalitions you would expect from Vatican, that is called Holy See on the UN level. You expect from Vatican to argue for women and men only and against gender, or from countries like Qatar, etc. But it's really interesting to see how these feminist NGOs are going into coalitions. These gender critical movements are going into coalitions with ultra right-wing movements. And I have to say, found this extremely interesting website on research on TAnon, so a follow-up to QAnon. It's two trans activists doing that research. I give you the website. One of the tropes in the US, at least, of ultra-conservative voices, it used to be the trope that men in transgender women are basically male rapists that are dressing up in order to better catch their prey. And this is not my view, obviously. There is another trope in recent years where conservative journalists and voices are cramming out detransitioned people. So people who have transitioned to a different gender, but then detransitioned back to their sex assigned at birth, and now give these narratives how they so regret that they were blinded by liberal ideology, and how now, after detransition, they are joining the gender critical movement. So really interesting. One of the researchers of TAnon is a detransitioned transgender non-binary individual that embodies detransition in a completely different way, and does research and finds really indeed money connections between gender critical NGOs and ultra right-wing foundations like the Heritage Foundation in the United States, and finds connections in, and this probably doesn't come as a surprise, with anti-vax movements. There is this convergence of herbalism and alternative life forms that goes back to, that connects to different feminism, the mystique of motherhood, the free birthing movement. So there is really an enmeshment on a large scale that I at least was unaware of, and that shapes law in the United, and this is how we are not talking language, and this is how we are talking language actually shaping life chances. Because what the gender critical movement really does in coalition with the right-wing movement is they are not going for let's make transgenders invisible. They are going for let's eradicate it. Let's make it absolutely impossible to exist as a transgender or a non-binary person in our country. And so you can see in the right graph shows you how anti-trans legislation has exploded. And only in 2024, which we are not only halfway through the year, 550 new bills have been introduced in 42 states to push back against trans people's participation in sports, push back against access to healthcare, push back against access to gender-neutral bathrooms. And Mart has mentioned that, yeah? What an easy thing to do and good for everyone if we have a unisex bathroom. Strangely, the bathroom has become a really dangerous place for trans and non-binary people to be, at least in the United States, yeah? Not, yes. So I'm only giving you a little glance here that 6%, so there we have a large transgender survey, and you have the source. There is large reports, but from the latest wave, we only have a little preliminary findings report where it finds that 6% of respondents, and it's a large sample with more than 20,000 people, have been verbally harassed or attacked in the bathroom. And we also see complete economic marginalization because of workplace discrimination, right? More than a third of transgender respondents are living in poverty. Let's look at trans lives in Europe for a minute. And you have excellent data from two FRA surveys that took place. What you can see, the lowest bar is experience. This is a bar on experience of some kind of harassment in the last 5 years. The lowest bar on this graph is all LGBTI respondents, which is a staggering number, honestly. More than half of all LGBTI respondents of that survey have experienced harassment in the last 5 years. And up goes the bars for trans and non-binary and intersex respondents. It's significantly higher. The gender offenders, right, quote unquote, who are passing that binary line are way more exposed to harassment and violence. This is a different, and that has also been visible in the first wave of the FRA survey. And I put you a red arrow for Austria. Austria is in the lowest third, but yet these are staggering numbers of experience of discrimination just because somebody, so we are talking actual lives. And continuum of violence. We start with speech, and it might turn into hate speech, and it turns into discrimination. And on the very other spectrum, we have violence. Here are numbers of how often people have been physically or sexually attacked in the last years. And more than a third of trans and non-binary respondents indicate that they have been physically or sexually attacked in the last 5 years, in comparison to 24% of all LGBTI respondents. Generally, I think Europe looks like a nicer place to live for trans identities right now, and compared to where I'm at, yeah. And there is countries where people have good protection and can choose their gender also legally. But on the other hand, we also logged almost 5,000 deaths since 2009 and transgender death reporting is problematic because most deaths are not, because they rely on police reports and people are not always identified correctly. I just wanted to tell you, this is a drastic impact. What we are doing in our learning environments has a drastic impact out there, right? Because it extrapolates into laws and policies and life changes. And we are all faced with this political and gender critical context. We are now again having this backlash and this global network of right-wing and TERF actors. You may have FLINTA learners. Mart has talked extensively about that. You may have TERF learners in your learning environments, and there must be a way to also address that. You can use methods and tactics that are more inclusive, some of which that have been discussed, and maybe you can bring in contents that talk about trans exclusion, trans rights, trans lives, or you can center trans authors. Non-binary authors, they can be just smuggled in, right? Like your pronoun practices. Oh, so one thing I want to suggest here is to turn to calling in, and I'm at 19 minutes 30. I beg for 2 more minutes. Calling in, I learned about it from Loretta Ross, amazing reproductive justice activist here in the United States. And really, for many years, Loretta Ross started as a person who observed hate groups. This Black feminist was very often the only Black body at KKK events or white supremacist rallies that she observed. And in her interaction with these white supremacists, she sort of concluded, if we want to depolarize and de-radicalize, we have to talk to these people. And the human rights movement cannot operate with the same exclusionary tactics like the right wing. We have to be in dialogue and teach our people, teach the human rights people to converse. That doesn't mean you can also withdraw. And I learned that from Ellie actually 10 years ago in an argumentation training for democracy. Yeah, I don't have to engage all the time. I can also withdraw. You can save your energy, but principally, I'm bringing home again the point that has been you got appetizers from Ellie and Mart, and again I'm bringing home the point. Don't call people out, call them in. I cannot talk about this extensively, but Loretta Ross, so how I learned about it, Loretta Ross is doing what she calls $5 social justice classes on calling in. You can do that. She does that several times a year on Zoom and quotes the transgender activist and thinker Natalie Wynn, who has spelled out what is entailed with cancel culture. How does it work? And to counteract cancel culture, we want to do calling in, which is basically a call out is public. And some people have to be called out publicly. Think Harvey Weinstein, Trump. I mean, we don't have to call in politicians and perpetrators, but calling in is a call out with radical love. We want accountability. We are inviting people. It's not identity based. It is supposed to repair, to reflect. It encourages a spirit of inquiry and also a spirit of humility for ourselves, right? As we in German say, feminist learning spaces are era-friendly learning spaces. Sorry, I made a mistake. It's my first time being alive. And let's see how we can learn from that and move forward. I give you also a couple of conversation starters for calling in that I learned from in these $5 social justice classes, and that remind me of what Ellie taught 10 years ago, to question, to open up a channel of communication rather than to shut it down, to bring in new aspects. And that also reminds me a little bit of Brené Brown's concept of rumble language, where you are centering curiosity, you are wondering, you stay open. And calling in does not mean I have to be in solidarity with a white supremacist woman who does not deserve my support. But as feminists, we should not stand in opposition to one of the most marginalized groups of women or genders that are around. And along these lines, thank you for your attention. You will get my slides. Contact me anytime. I'm home in the summer in Graz, and I sure hope to see many of you around. Thank you.